The door to the library creaked open, and a gust of crisp autumn air swept in, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and chimney smoke. Juliet glanced up from her desk near the circulation counter, her fingers pausing mid-tap on the keyboard. A trio of teenagers wandered in, giggling and shoving each other in the playful way that only those with too much free time and not enough supervision could manage. Juliet offered them her signature bright smile and watched as they retreated into the cozy alcove near the graphic novels section. She had worked hard to make every corner of the library inviting, advocating for better lighting, more comfortable seating, and a larger budget for books that teens might actually want to read. It was worth it. They were here. The library, housed in a rambling Victorian building, wasn't just where Juliet worked. It was her sanctuary. The stained glass windows glowed softly in the afternoon light, casting amber and green hues onto the polished wooden floors. Shelves packed with books loomed like ancient sentinels, their spines a kaleidoscope of colors and titles. She loved the quiet hum of the place, the faint rustling of pages, the occasional cough or creak of a chair. It was here, in the heart of a town that seemed forgotten by time, that Juliet found purpose. And when she wasn't organizing book clubs or teaching kids how to use the Dewey Decimal System, she was fighting for something even bigger. History itself. Miss Caplan, a voice called, pulling her out of her thoughts. Juliet turned to see Mrs. Emerson, the town's unofficial historian, or, as Juliet liked to think of her partner in crime when it came to protecting the past. The elderly woman stood in front of the counter, a knitted plaid scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, her cane leaning against the desk. "Mrs. Emerson, I wasn't expecting to see you today," Juliet said warmly, rising from her chair. Mrs. Emerson's lined face broke into a knowing smile. "I've brought you something," she said, reaching into a worn leather satchel and pulling out a folded map. It looked brittle, even from a distance, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. She laid it on the counter with the care of someone handling a newborn. "This," she said, tapping the fragile paper with a bony finger, "is the original survey map of the Revolutionary War site you've been so keen on saving. Found it in my attic, buried under years of nonsense." Juliet's eyes lit up. "Mrs. Emerson, this is incredible," she whispered, her fingers hovering reverently over the map. "This could be the proof we need that the site is historically significant." The Revolutionary War site, a neglected patch of overgrown land at the edge of town, had been Juliet's obsession for months now. Rumor had it that troops had camped there during the winter of 1777, though official records were sparse. The land had been ignored for decades, its history reduced to a few half-forgotten anecdotes passed down through generations. But a few months ago, everything had changed. A development company had announced plans to bulldoze the area and build a luxury resort, a decision that had sparked outrage among a small but passionate group of preservationists. Juliet had been the loudest voice among them. "Have you heard the latest?" Mrs. Emerson asked, her expression darkening. "They're holding the town hall meeting sooner than expected, next week." Juliet's stomach twisted. "What? They're trying to rush the vote?" Mrs. Emerson nodded grimly. "They think if they move quickly, they'll get less pushback." Juliet's heart pounded with a mix of anger and determination. "They don't know who they're dealing with," she said, her voice fierce. "We're not letting them erase history just to slap a golf course on top of it." Mrs. Emerson chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "That's the spirit, dear. But you'll need more than passion. What's the next step?" Juliet carefully folded the map and placed it into an archival sleeve, her mind already racing. "We need to get this verified by an expert. If we can prove its authenticity, it'll bolster our case. And I'll need to update the campaign materials. Maybe add a new flyer about the site's historical impact." She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 4 p.m., and her shift ended in an hour. Afterward, she'd head to the cafe near the site to meet with a few friends who were helping with the campaign. They were brainstorming ideas for a fundraiser to cover legal fees, a daunting task given the developers' deep pockets. The thought made her pause. Shoulders sagging slightly, she sighed. It wasn't just the fight that wore her down. It was the fear of losing. What would happen if they failed? If the site was paved over, its history erased forever? "Don't let them intimidate you," Mrs. Emerson said softly, as if sensing Juliet's doubt. "You have the entire town behind you." Juliet smiled faintly, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Not everyone shared her enthusiasm for history, and some were eager for the money the development could bring. But she had no intention of giving up. "Thank you, Mrs. Emerson," she said, her resolve returning. "I'll keep fighting, for the site and for the people who came before us." As the older woman departed, Juliet returned to her desk, the map safely tucked away in her bag. The library was quieter now, the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows. She took a deep breath and opened her laptop, ready to dive back into research. Outside, the town clock chimed the hour, its deep toll echoing through the streets. Juliet smiled faintly as she typed, her fingers flying across the keyboard. After all, history wasn't just something to read about in books. It was alive, fragile, and worth protecting, and she would do everything in her power to save it. The light from the television flickered across the walls of Miles's small apartment, casting shifting shadows over the clutter of books, empty coffee mugs, and a stack of Blu-rays teetering precariously on the edge of the coffee table. From the couch, Miles leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his attention fixed on the screen. Even now, after years of reviewing films, he couldn't resist the pull of a well-told story. The movie's final scene faded to black, and the credits began to roll, accompanied by a swelling orchestral score that resonated deep in his chest. He exhaled slowly, pulling off his glasses and rubbing his eyes. Leaning back, he let his head rest against the worn cushions of the couch, his thoughts swirling. There was a poetic symmetry to the film's ending, a deliberate callback to the opening shot, and the way it had tied together the protagonist's transformation left Miles marveling at the director's craft. It was the kind of layered storytelling he wished he saw more often, and the kind that reminded him why he loved this medium so much. Still, as much as he admired the artistry, there was always something bittersweet about finishing a film. It tugged at a part of him he tried not to think about too often, a yearning for connection, for the kind of relationships that existed so effortlessly on screen. In real life, though, moments like that were harder to find. He sighed and glanced at his notepad where he'd jotted down observations during the movie. Time to write the review. He pushed himself off the couch, stretching as he stood, and moved toward the small desk tucked into the corner of the apartment. His workspace was organized chaos. A pen jar overflowing with pencils and markers, sticky notes clinging to the edges of his monitor, and, placed carefully off to one side, a leather-bound sketchbook. As Miles settled into his chair, his eyes lingered on the sketchbook. It was his secret world, the place he turned to when words weren't enough. Inside, pages overflowed with ink and graphite drawings, scenes from films that had left an impression on him, imagined snapshots of stories he dreamed of telling, and portraits of people he'd seen in passing and wondered about. He reached for it without thinking, flipping to a half-finished sketch of a Revolutionary War soldier, his uniform rumpled, his expression weary but resolute. Miles smiled faintly. He'd started it after stumbling across an article about a local preservation effort to save an old historical site. The story had struck a chord, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the idea of preserving something so fragile, or maybe it was the sheer passion of the advocates fighting to save it. He'd bookmarked the article and found himself sketching late into the night, imagining what the soldiers who once camped there might have looked like, what their lives might have been like. Now he studied the lines of the soldier's face, his fingers itching to pick up a pencil and continue shading the detail of the uniform. But no, he needed to focus. He closed the sketchbook gently, setting it aside, and turned his attention to his laptop. The cursor blinked impatiently on a blank document, waiting for him to begin. It was a good life, he reminded himself, a fulfilling one, in many ways. Reviewing movies gave him a chance to engage with something he loved, and the steady trickle of freelance gigs meant he could pay the bills. But it was also solitary. Too solitary, if he was honest. He'd spent most of his 20s focused on building his reputation as a critic, and somewhere along the way, connections, real ones, had slipped through the cracks. Lately, though, something had shifted. It had started with a dating app, of all things. At first, he'd been skeptical. The idea of meeting someone through a screen felt like a compromise, a pale imitation of the meet-cutes he watched on film. But then he'd matched with someone who called herself Historiquil. Her profile had been clever, filled with wry humor and references to history and literature, and her messages were even better. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, exchanging banter that made him laugh out loud and trading thoughts on everything from obscure Revolutionary War facts to their favorite books. Miles had never been one to open up easily, but with her, it felt natural, effortless. He didn't know her real name, but he knew that her favorite poet was Emily Dickinson, that she had a dog named Franklin, and that she'd once gotten into an argument with a librarian about the historical accuracy of a children's book. He'd told her about his love for film, but not about his illustrations. That part of him wasn't something he shared lightly. Still, he couldn't help wondering what it would be like to meet her in person. Was she as witty in real life as she was online? Did she laugh as easily as she typed lol? He shook his head, trying and failing to push the thought aside. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he glanced at it. A new message. From her. He swiped it open, a small smile tugging at his lips as he read her latest quip about 18th century fashion. Maybe, he thought, just maybe, this connection could be something real. For the first time in a long while, that thought didn't scare him. The steady murmur of conversation and the clatter of dishes filled the cozy cafe as Juliet fumbled through her bag for the third time. Her cheeks flushed pink as she upended her wallet, pulling out receipts, gum wrappers, and a stray bobby pin, but no credit card. She bit her lip, glancing at the barista who waited patiently behind the counter, her steaming latte and scone growing colder by the second. "I'm so sorry," Juliet said, her voice tinged with embarrassment. "I must have left my card at home. Let me just—" She reached for her phone, resigned to awkwardly canceling the order and retreating empty-handed. Before she could finish, a voice cut through the bustling cafe. "I've got it." Juliet turned, startled, to see a man with slightly tousled brown hair standing at the register beside her. He wore a shy, uncertain smile, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose. His hand, holding a chipped blue card, was already extended toward the barista. "Oh no, I can't let you do that," Juliet said quickly, shaking her head. "Really, it's fine. I'll just come back later." He hesitated, looking as if he might withdraw, but then he gave a small shrug. "It's no trouble. Think of it as a community service donation." His tone had a playful lilt to it, but his gaze was warm, reassuring. Juliet hesitated, caught between mortification and gratitude. Finally, she sighed. "You've cornered me. Thank you. Miles," he offered quickly, his smile widening just a fraction. "And you're welcome." "Juliet," she replied, offering her name instinctively. "I'll pay you back, I promise." The barista rang up the items, and Juliet grabbed her latte and scone, stepping aside while Miles paid. She hovered awkwardly near the sugar station, waiting for him to finish. When he joined her a moment later, carrying his own coffee, she gestured toward a small table tucked by the window. "Since you've already saved my caffeine supply, least I can do is let you enjoy it without feeling like a stranger," she said with a smile. "Join me?" Miles blinked, clearly surprised by her invitation, but nodded. "Sure, why not?" They settled into their chairs, the autumn sun spilling through the window and casting golden light onto the small space between them. Juliet wrapped her hands around her mug, her embarrassment fading as she found herself unexpectedly curious about her cafe savior. "So," she began, "is buying lattes for forgetful strangers something you do often, or am I just lucky?" Miles laughed softly, shaking his head. "Definitely a first, but I figured, you looked like you had a lot on your mind. Didn't want to add to the stress." Juliet tilted her head, considering him. "You're not wrong. I've been juggling about 1,000,000 things lately, so thank you again." "What kind of things?" he asked, his curiosity genuine. She hesitated, then decided there was no harm in sharing. "I'm trying to save a historic Revolutionary War site here in town. It's this overgrown patch of land most people ignore, but it has so much history. There's a developer who wants to tear it down for a resort, and, well, I'm doing everything I can to stop them." Miles's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition sparking in his eyes. "The Revolutionary War site? I think I read something about that. Isn't it the one near the old trailhead?" Her eyes widened. "Yes, that's the one. You've heard about it? He nodded slowly, choosing his words carefully. I might have come across an article. It sounded like something worth preserving. Juliet leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued. Are you a history buff? Miles shook his head, a small self-deprecating smile tugging at his lips. Not exactly. More of an artist, I guess. I like imagining the stories behind places like that. An artist? She echoed, her smile brightening. What kind? Illustration mostly, he said, pushing his glasses up with one finger. Sometimes just for fun, sometimes for freelance work. That's incredible, Juliet said sincerely. You know, we're actually looking for ways to bring the history of the site to life for the community. If you're interested, maybe I could use your help. Miles blinked, taken aback by the unexpected offer. Then he smiled, a faint blush creeping into his cheeks. I'd like that. Their conversation flowed easily after that, the initial awkwardness melting away. By the time they parted, the forgotten wallet seemed like a distant memory, replaced instead by the strange and wonderful feeling that they'd stumbled onto something important, something worth exploring. The library was quiet, save for the occasional creak of a chair or the faint hum of the old radiator. The late afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the sprawling oak table in the meeting room. Papers and open books covered every inch of its surface, along with Juliet's laptop, a half-empty mug of tea, and a small stack of poster board. Miles adjusted his glasses as he leaned over one of the sheets, his pencil moving swiftly across the page. Juliet sat across from him, scrolling through a digital archive on her computer, her brow furrowed in concentration. Between them lay a shared purpose, to save the Revolutionary War site with a presentation that would not only inform the town, but inspire them. Okay, Juliet said, breaking the silence. So I found records mentioning an encampment in the winter of 1777, just like I thought. But it's frustrating. There's barely anything about the soldiers themselves. It's all logistics, supplies, troop movements, that kind of thing. Miles didn't look up, his pencil still gliding over the paper. What kind of supplies? She blinked, caught off guard. Flour, salt, firewood, that sort of thing. Why? Well, he replied, his voice calm but thoughtful. What if we show that? A soldier sitting by a fire rationing out flour or hauling wood through the snow. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. It's harder to care about a list of supplies, but if people can picture the lives behind the list... Juliet stared at him for a moment, her mouth slightly open. Then a grin spread across her face. Miles, that's brilliant. If we can make it personal, make people feel the history, maybe we'll finally get them to listen. She stood abruptly, gesturing toward the books scattered across the table. I've got journals somewhere. Letters written by soldiers who camped in New England during that winter. They weren't at our site specifically, but they're close enough to give us a window into what it was like. Miles nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. Perfect. Text for the flyers and inspiration for the illustrations. She paused, watching him as he bent back over his sketch. His hand moved with a precision that fascinated her, breathing life into the page with just a few strokes. What are you working on now? She asked, stepping around the table to get a better view. He turned the paper toward her, revealing a rough but evocative pencil sketch of a soldier. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed with exhaustion. He crouched by a flickering fire, a tattered coat wrapped tightly around him as snow swirled in the air. Though unfinished, the drawing radiated a quiet strength, an unspoken story of resilience. Juliet let out a low whistle. Miles, that's incredible. He ducked his head, clearly embarrassed. Thanks, it's just a first pass. I'll add more details once we have the final text. No, she said firmly. It's already amazing. You're really good at this. His cheeks flushed pink, and he gave a small, awkward shrug. It's easier when the subject's interesting. Juliet chuckled, shaking her head as she sat back down. You're too modest. Don't think I'm not going to brag about having the best artist in town on my team. Miles smiled, quiet but genuine, and went back to sketching. For a moment, the only sound was the soft scratch of pencil against paper. So, he said eventually, his tone casual, what made you want to save this site in the first place? Is it just a love of history, or is there more to it? Juliet shifted in her seat. leaning back and cradling her tea in both hands. It's a lot of things, she admitted. I mean, yes, I've always loved history, but it's more than that. My parents used to bring me to places like this when I was a kid, little historical sites no one seemed to care about. They'd tell me stories, show me how the past wasn't just something dusty in a textbook. It was alive, you know. It shaped us. Miles nodded, listening intently. And now, she continued, her voice growing firmer, it feels like we're losing that. Developers come in, and suddenly it's another strip mall or luxury resort. And once it's gone, it's gone. You can't rebuild history. You can't get it back. Miles's pencil paused, hovering over the page. You're right, he said softly. It's worth fighting for. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Juliet felt something unspoken pass between them, a shared understanding, a mutual respect. Well, she said finally, breaking the silence with a grin, enough about me. What about you? Why did you agree to help with all this? Miles hesitated, tapping the pencil lightly against the edge of the table. Honestly, I don't know, he admitted. At first, it was just, I read about the site, and something about it stuck with me. And then I met you, and... He stopped abruptly, his gaze darting back to the sketch in front of him. I guess it felt like the right thing to do. Juliet tilted her head, studying him. Well, whatever the reason, I'm really glad you did. He looked up again, his face softening at her words. Me too. They fell back into work after that, diving into the details of their project. Juliet sifted through letters and records, pulling out evocative phrases and facts. Miles sketched and made notes, refining their ideas into something tangible. By the time the clock struck 7, the table was covered with drafts and mock-ups. A soldier's weary face here, a timeline there, all tied together by Juliet's words and Miles's art. As they packed up for the night, Juliet paused by the door, glancing back at him. You know, she said, I think we make a pretty good team. Miles smiled, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. I think so too. Outside, the autumn night was crisp and clear, the stars just beginning to appear. Together, they stepped into the evening, their shared purpose lighting the path ahead. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the windows of the library's meeting room and casting a gray pall over the already chaotic scene inside. Juliet's laptop screen glowed faintly on the table, the spreadsheet open to a glaring red number at the bottom of the budget sheet. Across from her, Miles was hunched over his sketchbook, brow furrowed as he shaded the broad strokes of a new illustration. His pencil moved with a kind of dogged determination, but it was clear to Juliet that he was fighting the same creeping frustration she felt. $800, she groaned, leaning back in her chair and running both hands through her hair. We're short $800. How are we this short? The question wasn't really directed at Miles, but he glanced up anyway, adjusting his glasses. Didn't Mrs. Emerson say she was going to reach out to her book club for donations? He asked. She did, Juliet sighed. And last week, 3 of them chipped in a grand total of $36. I love Mrs. Emerson, but it turns out her book club is more invested in wine than war history. She dropped her hands to her lap, staring at the mocking red numbers again. We're supposed to print the flyers and banners by Friday, and I can't even afford half the cost. This is a disaster. Miles set his pencil down and leaned back in his chair. It's not a disaster, he said, his voice calm and steady. We'll figure something out. Like what? Juliet asked, her frustration bubbling over. Bake sales? Car washes? We're running out of time, Miles. Meanwhile, the developers are throwing money around like confetti, and I can't even fund a decent poster. She knew she shouldn't direct her anger at him, especially since he'd been nothing but kind and supportive. But the mounting pressure of the campaign, the looming deadline of the town hall meeting, and the omnipresent threat of losing the site, it was all pressing down on her, turning her usual optimism into something brittle and sharp. Miles didn't flinch at her tone. Instead, he watched her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Okay, he said finally, standing up and stretching. We're taking a break. Juliet blinked. What? Miles, we don't have time for... Break, he repeated firmly, holding up a hand to stop her. You've been staring at that spreadsheet for the last 2 hours. You're burning yourself out, and that's not helping anyone. Come on. He grabbed his coat from the back of his chair and swung it on. "Let's go." "Go where?" she asked, still half protesting but already reaching for her own jacket out of habit. "You'll see." The rain had eased into a gentle drizzle by the time they reached the cafe, its windows glowing warmly against the dreary evening. Miles held the door open for her, and Juliet stepped inside, inhaling the comforting scent of coffee and fresh pastries. He led her to a quiet corner table and gestured for her to sit while he went to the counter to order. When he returned, it was with 2 steaming mugs and a plate of cookies. He set one mug in front of her, a chai latte, her favorite, and slid into the seat across from her. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly, though the warm mug was already cradled in her hands. "I wanted to," he replied simply. "Now tell me what's really bothering you, and don't say it's just the budget." Juliet hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. The low hum of the cafe filled the silence between them, and she finally sighed. "It's everything," she admitted. "It's the budget and the developers and the constant uphill battle. It's feeling like no matter what I do, it's never enough. I keep telling myself that the site is worth fighting for. But what if we lose, Miles? What if I'm pouring everything into this, and it all falls apart anyway?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and she bit her lip, embarrassed by the sudden well of emotion. But when she looked up, Miles's expression was steady, his brown eyes full of understanding. "I can't tell you that we'll win," he said honestly. "I wish I could, but I can't. What I can tell you is that if you give up now, you'll regret it. And more than that, you're not doing this alone. You have a whole group of people who believe in what you're fighting for, and you have me." The simplicity of his words settled something in her chest, easing the knot of fear and doubt that had been building for days. Juliet exhaled slowly, a small, grateful smile forming on her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, "for reminding me why I started this in the first place." Miles smiled back, a little lopsided and shy. "Anytime." By the time they returned to the library, the rain had stopped entirely, leaving the streets glistening under the lamplight. Juliet felt lighter, her mind clearer as they brainstormed new ideas for fundraising. Miles suggested a silent auction featuring local artists, and Juliet jumped on the idea, already listing people she could reach out to. "And what about your sketches?" she asked suddenly, looking up from her notebook. Miles blinked, caught off guard. "My sketches?" "Yeah," she said, her excitement growing. "You've been drawing all these incredible illustrations for the campaign. Why not auction off a few pieces? People would love them." He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know, Juliet. That feels, I don't know, personal." "Exactly," she said, her voice softening. "That's what makes them so special. You have a gift, Miles, and I think people would see how much heart you've put into this. Just think about it, okay?" He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Okay, I'll think about it." As they packed up their things for the night, Juliet glanced over at him, a warm sense of gratitude filling her. They were far from out of the woods, but for the first time in days, she felt like they had a chance. "Hey, Miles," she said as they stepped outside. "Yeah? I'm really glad you're here." He looked at her, a faint blush creeping into his cheeks, and smiled. "Me too." The door to the library swung open with a sharp clang, echoing through the quiet space. Juliet looked up from her desk, startled, her pen pausing mid-note over a stack of documents. The sound was unusual for this late in the evening, especially when the library was closed to the public for the night. Her fingers tightened around the pen as she watched Mrs. Emerson march inside, her usual calm composure replaced by something taut and simmering. "I thought you should see this," Mrs. Emerson said, her voice tight as she pulled a folded newspaper out of her bag and slapped it down on Juliet's desk. The faint smell of rain clung to the paper as if it had been carried through the evening drizzle just moments ago. Juliet frowned, confused, and reached for it. "What is it?" she asked, unfolding the damp sheet. Her heart sank as soon as her eyes landed on the headline. "Staw Family Legacy. Local development company eyes historic expansion." It read in bold letters. Below it, a glossy photo showed the clean-cut face of Richard Warren, CEO of the Warren Development Group and one of the most vocal advocates for bulldozing the Revolutionary War site. Juliet had seen his smug grin plastered across enough articles to recognize him immediately. But it wasn't his face that made her stomach churn. It was the smaller photo just beneath it. Miles. There he was, smiling faintly, standing beside his father at what appeared to be some kind of corporate gala. The caption beneath the photo read, "Richard Warren, CEO, and his son Miles Warren, local film critic and artist, celebrate the company's upcoming projects." Juliet's breath caught in her throat as heat surged to her face. Her fingers trembled slightly as she set the paper down. "Miles," she said quietly, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. "I thought you knew," Mrs. Emerson said, her voice gentle now, though her expression remained concerned. "I only just saw it myself, and I came straight here. He's been helping with the campaign, hasn't he?" Juliet nodded slowly, a lump forming in her throat. "Yeah," she murmured, her mind racing. He'd been there every step of the way, sketching, brainstorming, cheering her on through late nights and moments of doubt. And all this time he was part of the family trying to destroy everything she was fighting for. It didn't make sense. Why had he kept this from her? Was it deliberate? Manipulative? Her pulse quickened, anger and hurt bubbling to the surface in equal measure. She stood abruptly, shoving the newspaper away as if it burned her. "Thank you for bringing this to me, Mrs. Emerson," she said, her voice clipped. "I'll take it from here." The older woman hesitated, her lips pressing together in a thin line, but she nodded. "Be careful, dear," she murmured before turning and making her way back toward the door. Once the library was empty again, Juliet grabbed her coat and the newspaper, her movements sharp and purposeful. She didn't even bother locking up behind her as she stormed out into the rainy night, her steps quick and unrelenting as she made her way to Miles's apartment. Miles opened the door after her second knock, his expression shifting from surprise to delight. "Juliet," he said, his voice warm, "this is a nice surprise." "Were you ever going to tell me?" she interrupted, her tone icy as she shoved the newspaper into his chest. Miles stumbled back a step, his brow furrowing in confusion as he unfolded the paper. His face paled when he saw the headline, and then the photo. He looked up at her, his brown eyes wide with alarm. "Juliet, I can explain," he began, his voice careful but firm. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, the motion as much to keep herself grounded as it was to shield herself from the ache blooming in her chest. "You're part of the Warren family, the same Warren family behind the development company trying to destroy the site I've poured my soul into saving. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because," Miles faltered, running a hand through his hair. He sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Because I knew how it would look, how it would sound, and because I don't have anything to do with them, Juliet. Not anymore." Her laugh was sharp, bitter. "Not anymore? You're literally in this photo with your father at some development event." "It was a charity gala," he said defensively. "I didn't even want to go, but it was my mom's birthday and she begged me to be there." "And what about all the time you've been spending with me?" she snapped. "Was that just for show? To keep tabs on the enemy?" His eyes widened, hurt flashing across his face. "What? No, Juliet. I've been helping you because I believe in what you're doing. I thought I could make a difference." "You thought you could?" She stopped herself, shaking her head as she turned away from him, pacing in his entryway. "You should have told me, Miles, from the start. How am I supposed to trust you now?" "I didn't tell you because I was afraid this would happen," he said quietly, "that you'd see me as one of them." "How am I supposed to see you?" she shot back, spinning to face him again. "You're part of the reason I'm fighting this fight in the first place." "That's not fair," Miles said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm not my father, Juliet. I don't even work for him. You think I want another luxury resort on top of history? I don't. That's why I've been here with you, because I care." "Do you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because right now it feels like I don't even know who you are." Miles's expression crumpled, and for a moment the room was filled with the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. "You do know me," he said softly. "You know me better than anyone else has in years, and I thought I knew you too." She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came. The tension between them felt heavy, suffocating. Finally, she turned toward the door, her hand on the knob. "I need time, Miles," she said, her voice breaking slightly. He didn't stop her as she walked out, the door clicking softly shut behind her. The storm had calmed overnight, leaving the town wrapped in an uneasy stillness. The library's meeting room, usually Juliet's haven, now felt stifling, the walls pressing in as she paced back and forth. Her mind churned with questions and doubts, the memory of Miles's wide-hurt eyes from the night before still fresh in her mind. She hated the uncertainty gnawing at her, hated that someone she'd thought she could trust had thrown her world into chaos. A soft knock at the library's back door startled her. She froze mid-step, her breath catching. She knew who it would be. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to bury herself in work and let the anger fester. But another part, the part that still clung to the warmth of his smile, the quiet strength of his presence, tugged her toward the door. With a deep breath, she pulled it open. Miles stood there, hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, his damp hair curling slightly from the lingering morning mist. He looked tired, his eyes rimmed with a sadness that matched the ache in Juliet's chest. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence heavy between them. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. Juliet hesitated, her grip tightening on the doorframe. Then, with a curt nod, she stepped aside, letting him in. She closed the door behind him, the faint click echoing louder than it should have. Miles lingered near the table, his fingers brushing the edge of a stray flyer. "I'm guessing you're still mad," he said, his voice tentative. "Mad doesn't even begin to cover it," Juliet replied, crossing her arms. "You lied to me, Miles." "I didn't lie," he said quickly, turning to face her. "I just didn't tell you, and I know that doesn't make it better, but it's not like I was trying to hide something because I was working against you." "I was," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I was scared, Juliet. I didn't want you to see me differently." "I do see you differently," she snapped, her voice rising despite herself. "How could I not? Your family is the reason I've spent the last 6 months fighting to save that site, and now I find out you're one of them?" "I'm not one of them," he said, his words sharp with frustration. "I haven't been part of that world in years." "Then why didn't you just tell me that?" she demanded. "Why not be upfront about who you are? If you really believed in what we're doing, why hide it?" "Because it's complicated." Miles's voice cracked, and he took a step closer, his hands clenching at his sides. "You think I don't know what my family represents? You think I don't hate it? I walked away from all of it, the business, the money, the expectations, everything. My dad and I barely talk. I've been trying to make a life on my own, away from all that. And then I met you, and I thought—" He trailed off, his shoulders sagging. "I thought maybe I could just be me, not Miles Warren, the developer's son. Just me." Juliet stared at him, her chest tight with conflicted emotions. His words rang with sincerity, but the wounds from the previous night were still raw. "You should have told me anyway," she said quietly. "You should have trusted me enough to let me decide for myself what to think." Miles flinched, the guilt etched plainly across his face. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have. And I'm sorry, Juliet. I really am, but you have to believe me. I'm on your side. I care about this fight, about the site, and I care about you." The last sentence hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Juliet looked away, her arms tightening around herself. "I don't know if I can believe you," she said after a long silence, her voice trembling. "How do I know this isn't just some twisted attempt to win me over, to make me let my guard down so you can—" "Stop," Miles said firmly, cutting her off. "Just stop. You know me, Juliet. You've seen who I am, what I care about, what we've done together, those sketches, those late nights planning, those moments where we believed we could actually make a difference. None of that was fake. None of it." Juliet swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to cling to the image of the Miles she had known, the one who had always been there with quiet encouragement and unwavering support. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at her resolve. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered, the admission cutting deep. Miles's expression crumpled, and he nodded slowly, as if he'd expected the words but hoped he wouldn't hear them. "I get it," he said quietly. "I do. All I can say is that I'm not going anywhere. I'll keep helping, keep fighting for the site, even if you hate me, because this matters to me, Juliet, and so do you." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the worn wooden floor. Miles lingered for a moment longer, then stepped toward the door. "I'll leave you to it," he said softly. "If you ever feel like talking, you know where to find me." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Juliet alone in the quiet library. She stood there for a long time, the weight of his words sinking deep into her heart. The town hall meeting was packed to capacity, the air thick with tension and the faint smell of damp wool coats. Juliet sat in the second row, clutching a folder of documents so tightly that the edges bent under her fingers. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room, taking in the faces of her neighbors. Some were familiar allies, people who'd stood beside her at every rally and fundraiser. Others, including a contingent of well-dressed men and women sitting near the front, were strangers, likely representatives of the Warren Development Group. At the center of it all, standing at the podium with an air of polished confidence, was Richard Warren. He was in the middle of a presentation, gesturing toward a glossy rendering of the proposed luxury resort projected onto the wall behind him. The image made Juliet's stomach churn. Where there should have been the wild, untamed patch of forest she'd fought so hard to preserve, there was now a sprawling vision of manicured golf courses and pristine condos. "This project," Richard said, his voice smooth and practiced, "will bring jobs, tourism, and economic growth to our town. We have the resources, the expertise, and the community's best interests at heart." Juliet swallowed hard, her anger simmering but held in check. She'd prepared her rebuttal, but her nerves frayed at the edges. She wasn't just fighting for history tonight, she was fighting against the sheer weight of money and power. When Richard concluded his presentation, the crowd erupted into a mix of polite applause and murmured dissent. The moderator stepped forward, announcing the beginning of the open forum. Juliet took a deep breath, readying herself, but before she could rise, another figure stood up from the back of the room. Her breath caught as she recognized him. Miles. The room fell into a hush as Miles walked to the podium. He looked nervous. His hands fidgeted as he adjusted his glasses, but his face was steady, determined. Juliet's chest tightened. What was he doing? "Good evening, everyone," Miles began, his voice carrying just enough to reach the far corners of the room. "My name is Miles Warren, and yes, as some of you might have guessed, I'm Richard Warren's son." A ripple of surprise swept through the audience, low murmurs breaking out. Juliet stiffened in her seat, her heart pounding. "But that's not why I'm here," Miles continued, his tone firm. "I'm here because I believe in preserving the Revolutionary War site that this development threatens to destroy. I've spent the past few months working with Juliet Caplan and the preservation team, creating illustrations to help tell the story of this site's history. Some of you might have seen the flyers, the posters, the campaign materials. That was me." Gasps and murmurs filled the room again, louder this time. Miles didn't falter. He reached into his bag and pulled out a sketch, one of his most evocative works. A soldier huddled by a fire, his face hollowed with exhaustion but resolute. He placed it on the podium, angling it toward the crowd. "This isn't just a plot of land," Miles said, his voice rising with emotion. "It's a part of our history. It's a story of resilience, sacrifice, and survival. And once it's gone, it's gone. No resort, no amount of money can replace that." Juliet's throat tightened as she watched him, her anger and hurt from days before giving way to something warmer, something she wasn't ready to name. Miles turned to his father then, his jaw set, his shoulders squared. "Dad, I've respected your work. I've stayed out of it for years because I didn't want to interfere. But this time, I can't stay silent. I can't support this, and I won't." A stunned silence followed, the weight of his words hanging in the air. For a moment, Richard looked genuinely taken aback, his polished mask slipping. Miles turned back to the crowd, his voice softening but no less resolute. "I'm asking you, asking all of us, to think about what kind of legacy we want to leave. Do we want to erase history for profit, or do we want to honor it, preserve it, and learn from it?" The room was still for a moment, and then slowly applause began to break out. It started with Mrs. Emerson clapping her hands together with surprising vigor, and spread through the crowd until it filled the room. Juliet felt tears sting her eyes as she joined in, her heart swelling with gratitude and pride. Miles stepped down from the podium, his eyes meeting Juliet's. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to trust him again. The library's meeting room hummed with quiet energy, filled with townspeople huddled in groups, their voices low but determined. Juliet stood near the center, a clipboard in hand, scanning the crowd. She looked up as the door opened, and there he was, Miles, his shoulders slightly hunched, but his eyes steady as they met hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Juliet stepped forward, her voice soft but sure. "Miles, I'm sorry," he said, cutting her off. His words rushed out, as if he couldn't hold them back any longer. "For not telling you, for making you doubt me. I should have been honest from the start." Juliet's grip on the clipboard loosened, and she let it drop to her side. "I wasn't fair to you," she admitted. "I jumped to conclusions, and I let my fear cloud everything. I know you aren't your father. I see that now." Miles took a step closer, his voice low. "You don't have to apologize. You had every right to be angry. But I meant what I said at the meeting. I'm here with you, Juliet, for the site, for everything." She smiled, small but real, as the tension between them eased. "Then let's finish this together." They turned to the crowd, their voices rising above the quiet murmurs. Together, they rallied the room, organizing volunteers to write letters, make calls, and prepare materials for the town hall vote. Miles's sketches became the centerpiece of their campaign, each one bringing history to life in a way words couldn't. Juliet's passion ignited the crowd, her determination infectious. By the end of the night, the room buzzed with hope. Miles caught Juliet's gaze, and in that moment, their partnership felt unshakable. They would see this through, side by side. The late afternoon sun bathed the Revolutionary War site in golden light, casting long shadows over the rolling field now protected by a simple wooden fence. Juliet stood near the edge of the clearing, the brisk autumn breeze tugging at her scarf. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, letting the quiet settle over her. For months, it had been a place of worry, of fierce battles waged with words and determination. Now, it was a place of peace. Miles stepped up beside her, hands tucked into his coat pockets as his eyes swept over the landscape. "It's beautiful," he murmured, the awe in his voice unmistakable. Juliet turned to him, her chest tightening at the sight of his familiar, kind smile. "It's more than beautiful," she said softly. "It's safe. It's history, preserved." He nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "Because of you." "Because of us," she corrected, her lips curving into a smile. She reached for his hand, their fingers entwining effortlessly, as if they'd always belonged that way. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the journey they'd shared settling between them. "We did it," Miles said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Juliet squeezed his hand, her heart full. "We did."